Good morning, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us. We're going to just let folks trickle in for a minute or two, but feel free to drop in the chat where you're tuning in from today. Oh, College Park. Thanks for joining us, Caitlin. Columbia, Maryland, College Park, Chicago. Hi, Drew. Arlington. We got a lot of College Park, Bethesda. Lovely. Virginia. Hi, Sandra. Wildersburg, Maryland. DC. Hi, Adam. Thanks for joining us. Thanks, Mel. Good morning, Tracy. Catonsville. Wonderful. If you're just joining us, you haven't picked up on it, we are just all dropping in the chat where we're tuning in from, if you'd like. I'm sure, hopefully, some of you can see my beautiful campus background. Clarksburg. Hi, Zainab from Bowie, College Park. Oh, Leonard from California, Santa Monica. Thanks for joining us. Great. Well, folks are going to continue to trickle in for the next couple minutes, but I want to honor your time here today and honor our presenters' time. So, good morning, everyone, and welcome to Career Week. Whether it's your first event or your third event this week, thanks so much for joining us and for taking the time to meet your 2025 professional and personal goals. Huge shout out to our sponsors today, the American Pacific Mortgage and Maryland Department of Housing and Community Development. So, I'm excited to dive into today's program, The Consulting Mindset, Better Questions, Actionable Answers, with Rachelle Jayner and Paul Joseph. I'll let them both share a little bit more about themselves and get our program started. I'll hand it over to you, Paul and Rachelle.
Great.
Thank
Thanks so
you.
much, Ellie. Good morning, everyone. Just want to do sort of a quick background on the content that we'll be talking about today. And then, as Elliot indicated, I'll give Rachelle a chance as the esteemed Maryland alum on this presentation. I'll let her speak first about her background. But really, the genesis for the consulting mindset came from our collective approximately 50 years of experience in the consulting field. We both have big firm experience, and I also have small firm experience, as well as operating experience. So very a variety of different work environments as consultants, but as well as employees. So a couple of years ago, we got together and said, well, how can we apply this later in our lives? I'm in my mid-50s-ish, but also sort of the consummate career seeker. I'm self-employed and had some motivation for bringing the sort of the wisdom or the experience that we both had to this. So Rachelle and I connected on this idea that, her expertise in organizational behavior and dynamics and building systems of OB, and mine in strategy and marketing kind of lended itself to this complementary approach to topics that we've experienced and used as consultants. So this series is basically in the process of being created. We really kind of put our nose to the grindstone this past summer, so we're just starting to build out the content. And today, the topic that we'll be focusing on is asking better questions for actionable answers. So with that, I'll hand it over to Rachelle. Maybe give a quick background on yourself, Rachelle. I will do the same, and we'll just get into it. And also,
Awesome.
before you do, just as a reminder to folks online, by all means, we want to keep this conversational. If you have questions, Ellie's going to help us out, and I'm monitoring the chat as best I can as well. But if you have questions, please feel free to jump in. We want to make this a valuable use of your time as well.
Awesome. Thanks, Paul. So again, my name is Rachelle Jayner, and I am a Terp. I did my undergrad at Cornell, but I did an MBA program at the University of Maryland, and it was an amazing experience that I will be forever grateful for. And career-wise, I've spent a couple of decades consulting, and I've also spent a fair amount of time previous to that in functional human resources in a bunch of different industries. I built and led some HR functions. So I've done the work from the inside and from the outside, and across all of that, what has been the most beneficial for me in being successful is the ability to ask the right questions in the right way to get the information to do the best work that I can, which is I'm so excited to be talking about that today.
And similarly, I did my undergraduate work at Cornell. That's where we met too many years ago, and did my MBA at a small school outside of Boston called Babson College, which focuses on entrepreneurship. And at the time, I jumped into the consulting field in the late 90s, just as the e-commerce economy, the dot-com economy was emerging. So much of my professional background is strategy, go-to-market, planning, product management, and the like for tech-based companies. In the years since, I've also volunteered in local government. I've held local elected office and also served as the president of a regional chamber of commerce. So I've had some pretty eclectic professional experiences, each of which I can attest to the fact that it was my experience as a consultant, my ability to professionally listen and ask questions, be engaged, probably one of the most important aspects of my career success. So that's why we thought we'd start with this topic when we created the consulting mindset. It really applies in our personal lives, our professional lives, whether you're working for an organization, consulting to an organization, or starting your own business. So with that, I'll let Rachelle jump in with the content, and we'll be kind of handing things back and forth. And just want to reiterate my invitation for folks listening. By all means, raise your hand or just jump in with a question, and we'll do the best we can to field those in real time.
Awesome. Okay, so you don't have to just take our word for it. We'd like to point out that the topic of asking good questions is kind of a hot topic these days. There are a lot of smart minds talking about it and talking about why it's important. And there are a lot of reasons to be able to ask good questions. First and foremost, to be able to get the information that you need to take action and do good work. But also, it can show your intelligence, it can show your empathy, it can show your preparation and your knowledge that you're coming into a situation engaged and intelligent. You can see that the folks at Harvard talk about how it fuels innovation. It's absolutely true. You can unlock a lot of business opportunities, and it's good to ask the right questions if you're doing research to make sure that your questions are interpreted the same way to give you good results. So there are a lot of really good reasons why this is a hot topic in a lot of areas and a lot of disciplines. So wherever you're coming from, whatever work you're doing, whatever your background is, I think there's a lot to be gained for each of you on the call today to learn about this. So, and if you're a consultant or thinking about being a consultant, from my background as a consultant, it's always been really important to ask good questions up front. And to make sure that you know what you're going into and what your why is. So when you're talking about the why, we're talking here not just about the why are we talking today, but why do you want to ask good questions? And that's the next thing I want to talk about is the why is not only what can you get out of it, but what will you miss out if you don't ask the questions? And, Paul and I, over the years, as he so kindly pointed out how many years it's been, there have been some times where I didn't always ask the questions, and I'll share a quick story with you. One time when I didn't, and I could have gotten better results if I did. Many years ago when I first started consulting, I had a pretty basic project doing an assessment on an HR function, performance management. And I thought it went really well and I was really happy with it. And I did a great job, I thought, and I was getting ready to meet with my client to deliver the results. And so I put together what I thought was a fabulous, concise, really pointed PowerPoint presentation. And I briefed the client on the results, recommendations, where I thought we should be going. And I was super pleased with it. And at the end of the briefing, my client looks at me like I had lost my mind, and he picks up the report and he says, "What can I do with this? This is not useful to me. This is garbage." He picked up the report and he threw it across the table at me. So as a young beginning consultant, that was a horrifying experience. what I did from that point is I sat down and I asked the questions. I asked the questions that I should have asked from the very beginning, which was, what were you looking to get out of this? What were you hoping I would bring to you? Why did you want this information? What were you going to do with it? What were you looking for? So we had a candid conversation about that. I went away, I took the information, I repackaged it. It was all the right information. I repackaged it into a big, thick, like 50-page report in Word rather than a concise, targeted PowerPoint presentation. And I brought it back to him. And it was exactly what he wanted, and he was thrilled, and everything went well. So in that situation, I was lucky. The cost was not financial. Huge cost in terms of ego, but it was a learning opportunity to see that it is so important to ask the right questions up front and make sure that you know what the needs are up front to be able to get the right information.
Yeah, I love that story because I think it's such a classic, sort of what you don't know what you don't know. And sometimes you take that sort of leap of faith as a young employee in particular, or if you're a career transition or you might not be sure. Sometimes we're embarrassed to ask questions because we think we should know the answer. So we try to fake it till we make it, which sometimes is the right way to go. It depends on your environment. But when Rachelle and I started talking about this content, and I'm going to share an anecdote later, in her case, not asking a question cost sort of ego, as a blow to the ego, as a learning experience. It was personal, but not expensive in a dollar sense. I worked with a client that basically wasted $10 million because they didn't ask one important question. And we'll come back to that a little bit later in the presentation. But to me, what's really important, and given the variety, we've got a pretty diverse group of folks on this webinar this morning. It's really important. I don't care if you're a PhD and you've done business analytics. I don't care if you're a first-time employee. I don't care if you're a first-time parent or an aspiring spouse or partner in any kind of relationship. Asking questions and understand why you're asking a question. I think one of the best indoctrinations I got into the consulting field, and I worked in a boutique firm. I did not work in a large firm like Rochelle did. I did work in partnership with McKinsey and a couple of other larger ones. But my original boss worked for Bain, and my senior partner also had worked with Booz Allen. And my boss, when I took the job at his small firm, would always ask the question, whether it was day one of the project, day six of the project, or month seven of the project, what's the answer? And so he used questions not only in motivating our solution journey for the client, he used it to motivate his staff. He used it to set a beacon for us that we were always results driven. Many of us have heard, start with the end in mind and work backwards. That very much is consulting mindset 101. But if you're asking yourself the question, what's the answer? It's a great way to position yourself to say, everything I do, everything I say is deliberate with an end goal in mind. And I'm not saying to bias it. We're going to talk about biases and how we approach these in a few minutes. But that idea of using questions even for team building and culture building is something that I've noticed a lot of organizations missing the boat on. So it's really important to kind of nurture questions as though you were reading to a child.
Mhm. And on that topic, um, that's really that's really at the root of asking good questions. That childlike curiosity, that wonder, that driving need to know and to learn and to understand. And so that's really uh, at the root of what we're going to talk about today. The ability to maintain that curiosity and that wonder, and to think like a child in that continuing questioning. So anybody who's a parent, I know I've experienced this. Kids are always asking why over and over and over again. It can drive you nuts as a parent, but it's a really, it's an innate need, that innate curiosity that we're born with, to always want to understand and continue to ask why until we know it and fully understand it. And we lose that as we grow up, and we go through school and join organizations, and that curiosity and that drive to continue questioning things kind of gets beat down out of us a little bit. It's not acceptable anymore. But it's important, if you want to be able to ask good questions, to try and recapture that intellectual curiosity, that need to know, and to be able to think like a child and just keep asking questions until you understand completely.
Yeah, fearlessly and unapologetically, right? And this is where it's hard as adults because we sometimes bias or filter our own processes because we think it's socially inappropriate, or we might be innate introverts and have a hard time asserting ourselves, or, but because of the political structure, we don't want to ask a question because we're in a just do what I said environment. It's hard. This is not an easy, it's simple, but it's not easy, right? In terms of doing
Right.
that.
Exactly. Yeah. And so that's important to start out with that base of thinking like a child in terms of that curiosity. But when you're asking that question, you want to take that curiosity and ask questions like a grown-up in terms of be very disciplined, be very purposeful, and make sure that you're driving those questions very deliberately. So think like a child, but ask like a grown-up. And then lastly, one other thing we'll talk about today is what about when you're asking a machine? And then you kind of come full circle back to thinking a little bit more childlike, and that when you want to ask a machine, you want to be really clear about what you're asking and why you're asking it and how you're asking it, and tell stories. And we'll talk a little bit about that more later. So it's kind of a full circle. Think like a child, ask like a grown up, come back to that child mindset when you're working with AI and asking questions.
Absolutely. It's really the only hope for the human race. So keeping that childlike humor about things and approach to things is important. And I'm very optimistic about the future with augmented learning. Machines are never going to outthink people. They might out execute on ideas, but we're uniquely wired to be creative. And I think there's an element of disruption even in thought process, the way we ask questions. As big data sets and as analytics come to the fore, we're all wrestling with what does this mean for us? What does it mean for us as parents trying to teach kids? What does it mean for us as managers trying to develop a team? What does it mean for us as volunteers trying to affect change in our communities? These tools, AI has been a tremendous leap forward in terms of capacity to process information. But again, harkening back to my former boss, Peter, it's like, what's the answer? Why? What are you going for? It's really important. And that's where those of you with a liberal arts background, those of you with a non-technical background, I think have the edge, because I think one of the best books I've ever read in terms of sort of thinking about how do you manage in volatile or chaotic environments was a book called Deep Survival. And what the author found was the people that basically accepted their environment after a disaster and didn't lock into their rigid thinking tended to survive more frequently avalanches, plane crashes, things like that. It was the people that were specialized in survival training that were so rigid to the frameworks and the training that they had that they couldn't get over that. So this idea of being that sort of, persistent child, persistently questioning, making up stories. That to me is the X factor with AI. And we'll get into more of that, but I think it's innately human as well.
Yes. So in order to accomplish those goals, we put together a framework that we'd like to run through with you today. And it's really very simple. It's 8 basic questions, but it's deceptively simple. If you spend the time asking yourselves these questions, you'll be able to come up with some answers that are more usable, that are more actionable, that can benefit you. So don't let the simplicity fool you. We're going to run through each of these questions one by one and talk a little bit about what they mean. And then we'll run through some examples of how to put those to use. So the first question is, what do I want to know? Which sounds pretty basic. Obviously, if you're asking a question, you know what you want to know. But dig a little bit deeper in terms of thinking through, like, not just what is the answer to this question I'm looking for, but what's the business need that you have for asking that question? What are you looking to solve for? What's the problem that you're trying to dig into? So get a little deeper. And that ties into the second question, which is, why do I want to know it? And so thinking there about what am I going to do with this information once I get it? So I know what I'm asking, but what will I do with the answer to this question? How will it benefit me? Will it be driving a decision? Will it be sparking action? What is the purpose for wanting to figure this out? What is the need behind that? Kind of like the root of the question. And so that gives you like the context and the background for why you're asking the question, which will then in turn be communicated to the folks you're asking the question of.
And before we jump to the third one, I want to jump in here for a minute. So again, go harkening back to the, if you had the answer, what would you do with that information? It's the why do you want to know it? Don't underestimate the value of not only the information or the sort of traffic over the bridge that you've built, but the situation, the context within which you're asking that question. So we're going to come back. Rachelle mentioned the question she didn't ask at the beginning of this, and I'm going to bring that back later in the presentation. But sometimes we get so focused on information and knowledge that we don't think about the context within which we apply that knowledge. So in my experience as a consultant and what made me a very strong employee, I was director of product marketing and product management for two software companies as well in my career. What served me well as a former consultant in that role was I knew how to navigate an organizational chart. I knew the politics and I knew where the authority to make decisions, to purchase, to influence. Understanding those barriers to implementation of your answer is very important as well. So this is truly a 3, 4, 5-dimensional challenge. It's not just a simple set of 8 steps. Every one of these steps you can look at through a different lens with a different vantage point. And it's really important that you take that whole context, the story, if you will. It's the picture you're painting is really a mosaic. Your job is to collect those tiles.
Yes. So when you're thinking about why you want to know the question, that takes you to what data are needed to answer the question. And the reason this is important is sometimes that data are readily available, and sometimes they're not. So you need to think about, where is that information going to come from? Where am I going to ask that question? How will I source the information? For instance, if you're doing a workforce survey, is the demographic information that you need, is that in your HR information system, or do you need to go somewhere else to source that? Or, if you're doing market research, or, any kind of research for a project, like, where is that information available, particularly within an organization? Like, is it stored somewhere, or do you need to figure out where you're going to go source that information? So it's good to think before you ask, where is the information going to come from? So you make sure that you have access to the sources for that data. So that's important as well.
And that if you can't fully trust that source that you're triangulating in, you have to mitigate the risk of misinformation, outdated information, and so forth. So there's dimensions again to this question.
Exactly, yes. So thinking through that, the next logical question is, how should I structure my question? And this is such a huge topic, like we could speak for an hour just on this. So we'll probably just hit the highlights here in the interest of time, although happy to talk about this in the future with anybody who's interested. But when we talk about how to structure the question, things like, is it open-ended or close-ended? Are you asking a yes/no question? Are you asking somebody to answer something in their own words? If it's a close-ended question, how are you structuring the responses that they're going to choose from? Like, is the list of responses mutually exclusive and understandable? What are, those predefined answers set up correctly and structured correctly? Are you asking a question that's qualitative or quantitative? Are you looking for a description, or are you looking for a numerical answers? And are you asking one thing at a time? That's a huge issue right there, particularly in survey work, but even in just conversational questions. Are you asking one issue at a time, so that when you get the answer, you know what the respondent was answering and you're able to do something with that answer? Your choice of words. Oh, sorry, Paul, did you have something to add there?
No, go ahead. I'll keep going.
Okay. And then your choice of words are important as well in structuring the question. And by that, I mean, are you very clear in what you're asking, and are you communicating that question very understandably? Are you using very discrete, simple language so there's no confusion about what you're trying to find out? Are you avoiding things like double negatives, jargons, abbreviations, so that when you're speaking to people, they can interpret the question in the way that you meant it? Or if you're asking multiple respondents, are they all interpreting the question in the same way?
Yeah, No, I mean, look, we're living in a time where everyone's biased about the media. We have our opinions about what's a reliable source. That's a leading question. There's bias built into things. All of this stuff is, I think, in the popular press, and we all live it day to day. The other piece of structuring a question that I think is important is not only, what's the answer and what will you do with that information, but structuring the question set, if not the specific question, the set of questions that you will use to get to an answer is important because many of us, especially in the consulting world, our product is the knowledge that we've gathered. Our successful sale is transferring that knowledge to our clients. So I'm always not just collecting data, but thinking about the story that I'm going to tell at the end of the project. Who's the audience for that? To Rachelle's point, it's asking those questions in advance. Who's going to be listening to this information? How do I need to structure my questions to give me the pages of the story that I'm going to tell? So when I work, for example, with startups that are venture capital backed or seeking venture investment, VCs, they want to validate that there's a real market here. So more recently, validation has come from paying customers, subscribers, followers, whatever that volume of traction is. But there's usually a hypothesis from a startup's perspective that says, we're going to disrupt X. And if we disrupt X, we're going to achieve this much sales growth in the next 5 years. Well, investors just want their 10X return on their investment, or they're looking at things in that way. One of the most important questions you can ask if you're collecting data to tell a story or to support an agenda is validating your own hypothesis. So the idea, sometimes I would ask a very simple yes or no question, like when we were testing new technologies, is this a pain point for your organization? Yes or no? And yeah, it might be asking the obvious, and we get answers sometimes are 85% yes. But that was just something that gave comfort to the recipient of the story, right? So it's important to validate assumptions when you're asking your questions and thinking about the sort of portfolio of questions that will tell the story.
Right. And this is also important, not just in the context of consulting or project work, but even, just in your everyday life. This is just as applicable to, say, clarifying with your boss on a project that you've been assigned that you don't understand, or even interacting, with a partner or a friend. This is a broader concept than just talking to your clients, although it is of the utmost importance when you're talking to your clients. And the next thing to think about is the scope when you're structuring the question, the scope of the question. This means the obvious of like what's the area of area of focus that you're concentrating on. It can also be the scope of the audience. Are you targeting the right audience? How broad do you want that audience to be to gather the information that you need? And is that scope well defined from two perspectives? In your own mind, do you know what you're looking for? And do you know what is the scope of the audience that you want to get your responses for? But also, is that scope clear to the folks of whom you're asking the questions? Do they know kind of the area of focus that they're to keep in mind when answering the question? So you want to make sure you're being broad enough to gather all of the information that you need, but also narrow enough that your questions are answerable with information that you can actually use.
Right. And relevant and valuable to your original why. So the other thing, as consultants, we make a lot of money on scope creep, right? People want to go beyond the original scope of what they've hired us to do. So it's really important to remind, especially in a business to business environment or organization to organization environment, you really need to know when you're talking to people doing internal interviews, recenter on that why. Is this relevant to what I'm trying to do right now, or should we put that, as a future consideration? So it's important to understand the time implications of what you're doing as well. That will help you scope it. It will also help you stay focused and avoid political risk of not addressing something that might be a pet project of somebody else, right? So sometimes you don't want to be sabotaged by this, by what you're doing by somebody that's undermining you because you're not helping them. So it's a great sort of transactional approach to say, is that relevant to what I'm doing here? It's important, but it's not important now. And that's a very important distinction to make, and it comes into this area of scope.
Right, right. So then the next thing to think about is whether or not your question is original. And this seems really simple on the face of it. Obviously, you don't want to ask a question that you've asked before, but also consider from a few different perspectives. For interest in, for example, if you're doing some sort of research or assessment with an organization, check and make sure it hasn't been done before. I cannot tell you how many times I have spent, up to months on some sort of assessment or research, answering a question, only to find, when I've dug deep into the bowels of the files, that this work was done a couple of years ago and the answers were already there, or at least like a really good starting point. And so, the amount of rework that's, costing time and effort and money. So always make sure, is this a question that hasn't already been addressed? And it might not just be, has the question been addressed, but has it been addressed in this context or with the same audience? And the idea there is to make sure you are introducing new information and that you're looking for a new body of knowledge, and that you're not repeating stuff that's already been done or that's already accessible that you could save time by accessing, but are you adding value and finding out something new and usable?
Yeah, and something Rachelle just said is really important to emphasize. It's like, you have to understand, even if it was asked before, it might be dated information. It also might have made an impression on the institution or the individual that you're working with to the point that they're biased in their listening, right? One of the biggest criticisms of consultants is we tell people the time with their own watches, right? And my boss used to tell me, if the client said at the end of 6 months that we already knew that, then you probably did your job. Because if they really already knew that, they wouldn't have hired us. The fact is, we bring objectivity, we bring a different perspective. One of my early experiences with a tech company, I was doing some work in the telecom space a while ago, and the guy that I was selling to, the CEO of this business, said, Paul, what are you going to tell me? I've been in this industry for 30 years. What are you going to tell me that I don't already know? He was testing me out. I was selling this consulting services. And I said, well, you might have all the answers, but I'll tell you this, they're filtered because your customers won't be honest with you, right? I can get at things that they won't tell you to your face. I can bring objectivity and I can bring a level of reliability to the information that you're getting as a senior decision maker, because as a third party, I can disarm the conversation. There's no political baggage associated with it. There's no history. And I can't tell you that was such a resounding answer with this CEO. It's really important to remember that. And also, as I said before about organizational charts, if you're trying to accomplish something inside your organization and there's a culture of, oh, we tried that, it didn't work, it's really important that you understand, yeah, maybe the question isn't original, but it's original now. It's original post-pandemic. It's original in the age of AI. So just because it's not original in their mind, there could be some layer of originality you can bring to the table by bringing different elements to that question.
Right. Okay, so the last two questions are closely related. And the first being, what assumptions have I made? And this is important because you want to make sure there's clarity of understanding between the asker and the responder. And sometimes you have assumptions in your question. Sometimes they're there. You're making an assumption and you're acknowledging that, but sometimes they're hidden in the question and you don't realize they're there, or you don't realize that you might be phrasing your question such that you'll cause the respondents to have an assumption that may or may not be valid. Sometimes they're valid assumptions, sometimes they're not, though, and they can get in the way of getting to what you need. I have a really simple example of that happened to me a few years ago. I was working on a workforce survey for a client organization. And, up front in a survey, you often ask for, demographics, your name, your organization, and whatnot. Well, one of the very first questions was, of course, asking for a name. It was not an anonymous survey. So we asked for first, middle, last name. And then when we launched the survey, we realized the survey, it wasn't working. The questions weren't moving forward because they were mandatory fields. And not everybody has a middle name. We made an assumption that everybody has, that standard construct of first, middle, last. Well, they don't. And then respondents weren't able to move forward with the survey because they couldn't get past that field and they didn't have a middle name to put in there. So that's a really simple example. But, sometimes that's the stuff that can really hang you up and cause a problem. So make sure to take a look at your question, dig deep, and make sure there are not any assumptions built into that question that shouldn't be there.
Yes, and to take that further out. So that's sort of an inside out approach. From the outside in, the other pieces of assumptions we need to make have to do around our cultural literacy, right? How, are we assuming an American bias on a global question, right? What frame of reference are we bringing to things? We are all biased based on our experiences. So it's really, it takes active work to try to neutralize as best you can the biases that are there. Honestly, the only way you can do that is with a diverse team being challenged. I like to use the acronym CYA, which has a different implication, but people in corporate world know what CYA stands for. But I tell people it's actually challenge your assumptions, right? Challenge your assumptions, challenge your biases. And so to me, that's the key to being, having a high EQ and being intellectually honest about the information you're gathering. Only then can you say with 100% confidence that you did the best you could. You might not be 100% accurate, but you did the best you could in terms of process. And you
Right.
have to, that's also time and resource bound as well. You can only do so much because there's always a trade-off between time and money.
Of course, yes. And Paul mentioned bias, which is a nice segue into the last question in our framework here is to ask yourself what biases might be hidden in the question. And this is another topic that we could talk about for like a full hour because there are so many biases that we might inadvertently have. We're human. It's built into us. There's nothing we can do about that. But when you're asking a question, you want to make sure you're not inadvertently using that bias in a way that will get you something different than what you were looking for. Um, Particularly in surveys, but in interview questions and in research, any other way that you're relying on those questions, even just a conversation with a client, there are certain words or phrases that might carry connotations or imply some sort of judgment or provoke an emotional response, and you want to make sure that you're not using words like that inadvertently. And there are a lot of biases in research that you want to think about. Like there's a social desirability bias, which means like if you're asking a question that might make a person feel like they have to answer a certain way in order to make themselves look good, or a confirmation bias. Are you wording your question? Are you wording it to support the the notion that you already have in your head, like a theory that you have, or a hypothesis that you're looking to prove? You want to make sure if you're looking to prove or disprove that, don't ask the question to lean towards one answer or another. Um, there's an acquiescence bias. If you have a yes, no, or agree, disagree question, sometimes you can word that question to lean a person towards agreeing to that question. You want to be careful of things like that. So there are so many more, but the point is, be careful with your wording that you don't turn your question into a leading question that directs the respondent to a particular response. And you want to make sure that question is neutral enough to get to the opinion that you're looking for, or the true response that you're looking for, instead of leading it uh, where you are hoping it might go.
Absolutely. And just lastly, again, from the outside in, it's in addition to asking what biases are hidden in the question, what biases are hidden in the respondent pool? Are you targeting the right folks to answer the question? Are you looking for people that think alike already? So you might have bias built into the question. You might have bias built into your questioning process. So these are important dimensional aspects of things. So Rachelle mentioned, there are 8 steps here, and this is very basic information in terms of the words, but the implications are tremendous and very complex because they require, like I said, intellectual honesty and a little bit of political bravery when you're engaging with institutions that have a lot of, gravitas towards them. It's hard sometimes, especially as a first, individual contributor, first time employee that's trying to get into management. Or if you're a manager trying to be a change agent in an institution that says it wants to change but truly doesn't, you have to understand all of these things as you're trying to affect that change. So.
Right. So that you can use this framework. You can use this framework to make sure you're asking the right questions to get the information you need. You can use this framework to show that you know what you're talking about, and that you're intelligent enough and observant enough to know what to ask. So I think in whatever situation you're using this framework, it can really help you get to what you need, so those answers can be actionable and that you can use them. Sorry, go ahead, Paul.
Nope, I agreed. I was just going to say we'll kind of let's put it to the test a little bit. Ellie, I don't know if we have the capacity. I'm looking at the chat right now, but what we wanted to do is throw up a couple of sample bad questions and see if people want to chat in what's wrong with it or what would you do to change it. Feel free to just chat your answers, and Rochelle and I will go back and forth if people feel less compelled to do that. But here we want to kind of illustrate some of these errors in judgment or bad questioning. What can we do to improve these questions? What can you do to make this question better? So.
Great. So the first bad question up there you can see is, do you enjoy collecting and analyzing data? So what do y'all think we could do differently with this question to make it more effective and to get answers that are more actionable? And of course, I'll ask Paul to jump in, but if anybody has any thoughts in the chat.
Yeah, well, I'm seeing enjoy is
Yeah.
extremely subjective and maybe describe characteristics of joy, make it open-ended question, so as opposed to a yes or no question. Yep,
Mhm.
some good stuff here. Open-ended. Yep. Good.
Paul, any thoughts from you on that one?
Yeah, well, I mean, to me, that's part of the sort of bias here is that do you enjoy collecting data as an assumption that you're making basically, and it's also it's amalgamating two different questions, right? So this idea that I enjoy collecting data and but I hate analyzing data, or vice versa, right? So there's two questions buried into one here. So I would, in addition to sort of the feedback that we got here, I would also separate that out to be very clear because one of the goals to be credible is you want to minimize or eliminate any ambiguity in the knowledge that you're conveying to somebody, right? Because if the
Mhm.
answer to the question is yes, I enjoy collecting and analyzing data, or no, maybe I only don't enjoy analyzing data, right? So it's important to break that out. I can't tell you how many projects I've worked on, research-based consulting work, where we've done some primary research and the client wants to get in, 20 questions when we only have time to ask 5. So they basically take 20 questions and make these compounded questions that I said, if you get the answer to that, you won't be able to do anything with it. So that's why we kind of focus on this idea. What do you really need to understand? And I think the biggest error in judgment people make because of corporate pressure, their employers' pressure to do it and do it fast, is that you set yourself up for a longer term pain because you're not doing it in a stepwise way. Take the time to be deliberate and build towards your answer. So this is a good question, sort of sample of a compounding question that also has subjective jargon in it.
Yes. Great. Okay, so second bad question. Where do you like to hike? Does anybody have any thoughts about why that question isn't ideal or what might be done to make that question a little better to get what you need out of it? And again, these are very basic examples, not necessarily business-based, but just to get the idea across.
Business space if your boss told you to take a hike, but that's
That's a whole different situation.
exactly. Any criticism of that question?
There we go. We got
Okay,
a
there we go.
couple.
Yeah,
Too open-ended.
Mhm.
Yeah. Yeah.
exactly.
Assumption that you like to hike. Yeah. I mean, hopefully you're not
Mhm.
asking on a cruise ship, right? Assume that likes hiking. Exactly that. Yeah, there's bias written, do you like to hike? Ask the person. Don't make that assumption that they do,
Mm.
you know?
Exactly.
Also,
Yes,
don't
yes.
make the assumption that they don't. I'm a sort of recovering introvert. I've always been a fake it till you make it extrovert, where it's, if I go into a networking situation, um, I'm a second born listener, quiet person before I engage. And because of that, I had to really overcome my reticence to think broadly about what other people think. I assume other people are equally either reserved or they're the exact opposite in my mind. They're so extroverted that they are a certain way because they're extroverted. So this idea of assuming people are a certain way, is important to get over and really be an active, empathetic listener in an environment.
Okay, so last example here is a bit of a doozy. There's a bunch of things wrong with this one, but the question is it unlikely that you would use OTC or RX for a cold or flu? So there are a number of problems in that question. Does anybody want to volunteer any thoughts on what might be the issue or how that question could be improved? Leading question, abbreviations,
Yep.
2 questions. Yep. Mhm.
Yep.
Yes, cold and flu are different. Right.
Somebody must work for NIH. Negative question. Yeah, it's a which is, has some biases to it. That might be an interesting way to get it an answer, depending on the sort of respondent pool that you're looking at. So yeah, that's a great point. You want to be careful of asking negative questions because they tend to be leading, right? It's that same question, is it? So the idea is that, again, it's an assumption that you use over-the-counter medication. So this has jargon in it, the OTC versus RX. Does everybody know that means over-the-counter and prescription, for example? Right. And so this idea, the difference between the two is important to understand, and for all the reasons you just listed here. So again, it's not that this is it particularly complex. It is very simple, but you have to be aware. You have to be, again, high IQ or EQ, excuse me, as a person, emotional quotient. This idea that you're empathetic in your information gathering is critically important. So let's end the framework stuff with this concept of artificial intelligence. How is AI changing things? When we ask questions of AI, and we've got a couple of questions here. Rachelle and I put together a couple of scenarios here. One from personal experience. My first foray into AI was I was hosting a holiday party for my family, and I had all kinds of people, but I adapted it to make it more relevant for the next couple of weeks with apologies to any Commanders fans that are out there. I was hoping to have different teams in this example, but you know, asking Copilot or Chat GPT, what food should I make for my Super Bowl party? It's great, but I don't necessarily want to rely on a bunch of engineers' biases about what to eat, because you might end up with Cheetos and Diet Coke or something, whatever they're eating at 2 a.m., coding the answers, right? A better way to ask that question might be to reframe it and say, I'm hosting a Super Bowl party for my family and friends. There will be 20 of us. What type of food should I serve that will be easy to eat while watching TV? So again, I'm starting to tell a story. I'm illustrating the book. So we talked about telling a story, but when it comes to AI, I think in terms of pictures. I'm a visual learner. I'm a visual sort of communicator. So for me, that's why this context concept is so important. Obviously, there's a whole discipline around prompt engineering, and it's important to work backwards from the answer that you want to get. I would argue that what we have in artificial intelligence and what we've barely scratched the surface on, and I don't know those of you on the webinar like me, but I grew up with Crayola crayons coming in, the 8 pack, the 16 pack, the 64 pack, and so forth. Like, how many colors can we add to this palette? It just opens up this world of possibilities. So being specific, painting a very clear picture. I love the analogy, and I used it before, of the mosaic, right? The smaller the tiles, the more vibrant the colors, the more clear we are in our asking, the better results we will get, the more time we will save later, and the more open to new questions we will be set up for. So this idea of, and I won't read it for you here about the family of six and all that. You can do that. But you get the idea. This is a good question as I think about my Super Bowl party. I want it to be fun. I want it to be relevant for people. And knowing that it's Philly and Kansas City, hey, let's have some barbecue and cheesesteaks in there, right? So this idea that hopefully and maybe there's other things in Philly that I don't know about other than cream cheese and cheesesteak. So with due respect to my Philly followers here, that's pretty much all I know it for. So. And then, as another one that might be relevant, I actually yesterday had a coffee with a person who was recently laid off from a major pharmaceutical company, a global company that has a presence in Greater Boston. And this individual was their corporate librarian in their local plant. And so as a corporate librarian that was laid off, we were meeting and talking about, well, what are the opportunities? In my Chamber of Commerce experience and my local political experience, I have a pretty good network in our region, but we were talking about, well, what is it that you really want to do? So, one approach is to say, well, what should I do for my next job, right? Asking AI this very open-ended question about what is my future? What could it look like? To me, this is the equivalent of shaking a magic 8 ball. It's like, right, you get a very simple, answer. It could be it could help if you're truly mentally blocked or just so shocked about things. You have to start somewhere. So while even a bad question being asked is better than no question, right? This idea of being curious is important to start. But if you're a job seeker and you're not sure what you have, or you tend to diminish your experience or say nobody cares about that. A lot of us, when we're in a negative place, will project that negativity in our framing of questions. So I always encourage people to think about the fact that, put yourself in the buyer's shoes. You've got a lot of talent. Every one of you on this webinar has a unique perspective. As I told that CEO in the telecom space, it's like, I don't know boo about the telecom space. I'll get to know the information I need to know, but I do know your customers aren't telling you the whole story. And I do know my framework to get that answer is better than what they're going to tell you. So you need to have that confidence to project, hey, I've got something to offer, whether I've been an at-home parent for the last few years or I was serving in government and now I'm looking for a private sector job, whatever those transitions are, use AI to bring out those things that you don't know yet, right? How can I apply these skills? How can I apply this relevance and have a picture? So this last one again is sort of taking a much a deeper dive and a more varied story, if you will. You're telling AI the story in your question. Set your goals, paint your picture, pave your path, right? So these things will all lead the intelligence to bring you in a direction that matters. And again, this isn't the end, right? Bad, better, best. There's continual better, right? So there's always continuous improvement. This isn't rocket science, right? That's the whole point.
Right.
But if it
Right.
were rocket science, it actually has its grounding in a really good, credible source here. What we just did with that AI example is essentially listen to Albert Einstein, right? This idea that, a better question is solved just by thinking about what to ask, right? Asking a question will solve the problem if you're clear about the question. And I know we want to have some time for Q&A here, so I'm going to wrap up fairly quickly here. We talked about the questions that weren't asked before. And I had an experience once. I was in Austin, Texas during the dot-com boom, and a company had received $10 million in VC funding. And they were basically going to automate. This is the pre sort of wireless technology infrastructure, but they were going to bring wireless technology to vending machines. And they raised all this money to basically help the vending machine industry remotely communicate what was out of stock, what needed to be replaced, what products were turned over in terms of freshness. What they failed to ask was, how is the industry structured? So they made the naive assumption that said, well, there are X number of tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of vending machines out there. We just need 10% of those to make a viable business out of this. But they didn't realize that Coca-Cola Enterprises, PepsiCo, and I think it was Canteen, the catering, the vending company, those three businesses commanded more than 80% of the market. So if you didn't have a contract with one of those three companies, you were not going to make that scale. So I was at a board meeting where actually one of the early investors in America Online was there. And he was laughing at how embarrassing it was that they didn't understand the industry they were trying to sell into. And so for me, that was the tell that it said, hey, I'm onto something here. I might not have all the answers, but I know if I ask things in a better way or a different way, I'm valuable. And to me, that's sort of where I want to kind of land the ship, or do we land a ship? I guess we do. We bring it into shore. But end on questions here, Ellie. Kind of turn things back to you or to folks if you have questions. I know we've got about 10 minutes or so.
Yeah, we'll let some of the questions come trickling in. I'm excited to see what this group has to ask you. But I've been thinking throughout this whole presentation, thank you both so much. I mean, how do you balance navigating, in my own words, kind of the zoom in and zoom out of question asking? Because in your last example, Paul, I feel like as a manager, sometimes it's helpful to ask some of these open-ended questions because you may get more information than if you ask something extremely specific. So how do you kind of balance that kind of push and pull of question asking and knowing when you really need to ask a detailed question versus give maybe some space to gather more information and then, sift through yourself?
I'll be interested to hear how Rachelle answers. From my perspective, I think there's two layers to what you just said.
Mm,
One, part of it is, how do you know when to ask the clarifying question? Part of it depends on
mm,
what you're going to do with the information. If you already have the knowledge and the credibility in the recipient's mind, don't waste your time validating something that they believe you're already credible with, right? You, by nature
mm,
of your degree, as MBA students, as graduates of UMD, you guys have credibility in your discipline, right?
Mm.
So don't waste your time just telling people that you've got credibility. If they know it, move on and don't ask questions that revalidate something they already know. The other way to think about questions too is like a life cycle kind of curve. There's sort of this S curve to a life cycle, the early stages of things. You need to kind of have general information. As things grow and evolve over time, you need to get more specialized. And that's true for organizational structures and things. But if you're in that place where the answer you're trying to get is an early stage question, to
Mhm.
me, that's where more open-ended, more creativity, more information is important because it gives you the DNA to build the better questions later. So that first example that we gave that you had to split out those two questions, most people fall into that trap of asking the compounded
Yeah.
question. It's this time to step back and say, you know what? We're going to do two phases of this survey instead of one.
Yeah.
And I think it's really important to take a look, in that framework, the first two questions were what do I want to know and why do I want to know it? And I think if you really focus on those and focus on the why do I want to know this and what am I going to do with this information? I think that will give you the answer of how you want to ask it because it'll help you figure out, like we talked about the scope as well.
Thank you. We just had a question come in from Drew, which I love. Do you have any advice for getting clients to slow down and really engage with your questions?
Good question.
Hmm.
I hate to ask questions to clarify your question. This raises many questions in my head. The simple answer is, you know, do you want to get this right or do you want to get this right now? And to me, it's again, it's the cost of artificially, compressing time. So again, is if it's truly a client that you're asking, they will make the time. If you're on a survey asking respondents to bring data back to a client, it might be harder because you haven't established that relationship with them. So to me, one of my best friends, another friend of mine from Cornell, actually he's developed a multi-million dollar sales consultancy. Two of the most important things I learned from him is number one, sit in silence after you ask a question and let people feel the need to further clarify. So if they're rushing, that awkward silence almost compels people to talk, right? So it's a device that he uses in a sales discussion. You can almost use it in a research discussion. And again, to me, the other one is if the client is truly interested in solving a problem, as opposed to hear them self speak or dictate, there's a reason they're coming to you as an outsider. So to me, it's about that question of do you need it right or do you need it right now?
Mm, that's good advice. We don't have any more questions in the chat at the moment, but where can folks find you if they have follow-up questions?
Funny you should ask. We have one more slide. So
And
again,
I
our initiative here, and I'll let Rachelle kind of close us out, but obviously our contact information is there. But this was the whole sort of pretense for creating the consulting mindset. We're in the earliest stages of creating a place where people can come and ask us questions and figure out what we need to be doing to share what we've got. So,
Yes, and I'd also like to add, if anybody's looking to get a copy of the slides, feel free to reach out to us, email us, and we'd be happy to send those out. But bigger than that, we are really looking with this community that we're building, the consulting mindset. We're looking to build a conversation where we ask each other questions, learn more, share content, and really come at things with that curiosity that we are talking about and build a community that can support each other and ask each other questions. So we encourage you, if you're interested, you can use the QR code there to join us in LinkedIn in the consulting mindset and to continue this conversation, which we're happy to do in any forum through UMD or through LinkedIn or however. We're happy to keep talking and we're happy to hear from you. So please do reach out.
It's definitely a conversation worth continuing. So, huge thank you to Paul and Rochelle for sharing their expertise with us this morning. And thanks to you all for engaging in this conversation. We're happy you joined us for Career Week. So, again, another huge virtual round of applause, if you can, to Paul and Rochelle. And I will send an email with the recording of this presentation to you all via email. So, thanks again to you both. And I'll close it out with a Go Terps. Have a great week,
Go Terps.
everyone.
great. Thank you.
Bye.